Good morning, everybody. Give me one more second here. All right. Well, I hope you all survived your Super Bowl weekend. I may have a smile on my face for one reason or another, may or may not have to do with Kansas City not winning a third. Guess I'm kind of a hater in ways, but we all have our things. Did anybody place any big bets on Kansas City? I hope not. Okay. So none of your betting folk. Okay. All right. All right. There we go. We got people rolling in. I love it. All right. So just by way of recap, I'm going to pull this over here so I can see my agenda. So January was largely focused on getting through the REPC. And you know what? We got close. And I'm just going to touch base on a couple more things to round out the REPC, and then we'll be off into seller's disclosures today. But before we do that, I just wanted to see if anybody had any wins over the past week. Somebody had to have a win. Please have a win. Share with me a win.
I got 35,000 knocked off a price from an appraisal.
Nice.
My clients were quite happy about that.
I would say so. So what was if you could give the 15-second version, what was the key thing to get the price reduction?
Mostly just making sure that the other agent knew that he'd messed up on the price right from the start. When I made the offer, I actually told him that I thought it was about 30,000 overpriced and showed him the comps. And so, going in, he knew, he had to know, because I made sure that I shared the comps and just said, hey, my clients want the home, but what are you going to do if it doesn't appraise?
Right. Well, that's awesome. And you know what? Listen, we hear a lot of the downsides to the current market, but this is one of the upsides, right? People are much more pliable than they were, let's say, 3.5 years ago. So, if you want to survive this business, I'm now pontificating, waxing philosophical on my 24 years in the business. You got to find the silver lining in the market, and it's not Pollyanna. You gotta find the things that are positive and make sure you're reminding yourself of those things. Am I right or am I right, Joyce?
Yes, you're right.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so anybody else with a win?
I had a cute little win, if you'll endure me telling you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I completed a small closing, and it involved some financial challenges. We were able to remove the subject to sale of another property clause, and we got that done. And then the sellers, it was an elderly woman who had passed away. There had been a few little odds and ends of a teacup set left in the cupboard. And just a month before, a little neighbor girl had asked me if by any chance I could get her a set of china. So with permission, yesterday I took over a little teacup set, and she stood there, she's 8, and she stood there in the kitchen and said, "These are so beautiful. Thank you." So it had kind of a cute little ending. And a past client referred a new buyer to me a few days ago. So boom.
Look at that.
Just trying to keep it all going and being a good citizen of the world as well.
It's funny, the little anecdotal stories, right? We can sit here and just churn and burn business numbers and ratios and this, that, and the other. But I've said this many, many, many times. Part of the reason I'm in real estate, and I think a lot of the agents I talk to, of course, there's the financial aspect of it, but there's the intrinsic, the non-cash value, the fact that you can impact people's lives, that you can make a little girl happy in the process. Yeah. These are some of the small wins that are kind of cool about what we do. So thanks for sharing that. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share so we can, let's see. Wow. All right, that is not what I wanted. I am sharing the wrong screen. So let me try this one more time. Oh man. Okay, you guys see that on screen, my REPC marked up form? All right, so we made it through, and trust me, getting through REPC in some level of detail is no small feat, because you know what, this is foundational to everything we do in real estate, right? I mean, there's a lot of tangents to the REPC, but it is the core document. And so to make sure that we have these covered and understand them well and know how to speak to our clients and make sure that we cover the appropriate things to fulfill our fiduciary of reasonable care, no small undertaking. So we made it through section 15, okay? And I wanted to hit section 16, right? This is I don't even know how to position this right. It's super important, but it is almost always perceived as the negative component, right, of our business. So we've got three remedies in section 16. So section 16 is just default. What happens if either party defaults, right? And there's three remedies, and you should all be able to rattle these off, right? It's pre-liquidated damages known as earnest money, or an equal amount of earnest money. There's the item B is the ability to sue to specifically enforce the contract when one party is in default. And then the third one is just kind of the open-ended one, which is sue any other damages, aka lawsuit, available at law. So those are the three options. Now, I want to just show you one thing that a lot of agents miss, and it's right here. And I'm going to underline it. Of the three options that are available, wow, let's try that again. There we go. Can you guys see that okay, or is it too small? We're good? Okay. Of the three options, one requires that you keep the earnest money in the trust account. So think back to the days when we were doing multiple offers and, you know, earnest money released to the seller, right? Now there's two variations on that, right? Earnest money to become non-refundable, that's okay because it's non-refundable, but it's still in the trust account. But if it's non-refundable and released to the seller, you just lost option B. Or even option B for, you have a mirror of these same options for the seller as well, right? Down in section 16.2. So if the earnest money gets released to anybody during the term of the contract, that item B in either section 16.1 or 16.2 goes away because you did not meet the contractual requirement of keeping the earnest money in the trust account. Sounds like a trivial thing, right? It's trivial until you have a situation where either your buyer or seller decides to sue the person to enforce the contract, to specifically enforce the contract. Now, here's a question for you. Has anybody been involved in a transaction where they actually sued for performance? Raise your hand, first of all. Listen, Austin and Haley and, oh, there you go, Parker, just in time. I got the video. Carrie, if you can throw your video on, that'd be awesome. Has anybody had that experience or even threatened? Nobody?
Yeah, I've had that experience where they've threatened.
Yeah. I get this. I've heard this. This is kind of in that category of urban myth, right? I've had so many agents and so many brokers say, nobody ever does that. Anybody else heard that? It's too hard. Nobody will sue for performance.
Yeah, you hear it all the time.
You hear it all the time, and here's the reality.
Especially when you're negotiating deals and you go, hey, this is a repercussion. And they go, yeah, but that's not going to happen. Nobody ever does that.
Yeah, and you know what? You don't need to have that fight at that moment, especially if it's not your client. But especially, you know, if it's a deal where things are a little you're not sure how invested the other side of the transaction is, this becomes more significant. And if you deal with a lot of real estate attorneys, you find out, no, this really is a thing. And it does happen more regularly than you had thought. Is it a high percentage of the time? No, but it happens enough that you need to be aware of it. Okay. So now I want you to think of section 16, right? And section 17 is linked. We talk about this one and we rarely talk about this one, right? And what does it say? In the event of litigation or binding arbitration arising out of this, what? What's the consequence? The prevailing party shall be entitled to costs and reasonable attorney's fees. And the reason I wanted to draw that out is a lot of times we say, if you talk about section 17, it's like, well, we're entitled to attorney's fees. That's only part of it. You know, if you go to district court, does anybody know ballpark what it costs to file a lawsuit in district court? Right, so I'm talking, you have small claims under $15,000 now, right? In district court, anything that's
It's
over
1,000,
that,
right?
what's that?
It's 1,000, isn't it? To file?
Over $3,000 just to file.
3,000.
Yeah, and typically they don't allow self-representation there. You need to have an attorney, and so you know that 3,000 is more like 5,000 just to get the wheels turning. Okay, so when I bumped up to a situation, and you guys, there's like an art form to this. If you think about if you were on the other side, I'm going to say this with two different tones. And if you were on the other side, either as an agent or a buyer or a seller client, and I came at you saying, well, you guys better get your crap together or we're going to freaking, exercise our options in section 16. And if we go the attorney route, you're going to catch our attorney's fees. And how are you feeling right now? What do you want to tell me? Careful, it's being recorded.
I'm feeling confrontational.
Yeah. And I hope it's not a surprise to any of you that have experience, whether in sales or in marriage or with kids or whatever. The minute you start talking in that tone, it's almost a default human nature response to dig your heels in and get into fighting mode. Okay? That's like 85, 90% of the time, that's the reaction you're going to get. It's kind of like, oh yeah? Well, watch what I can do back. Now, is that really what you want to see happen? We want somebody to not go that route. We want them to stay engaged with the contract. We want them to either buy or sell and do it responsibly and abide by the terms of the contract. So start with the end in mind, right? Always remember that. Start with the end in mind. Where am I trying to go with this? And anybody, Savannah, I know you're reading this book. Anybody been reading the Mel Robbins book, Let Them? It's actually a pretty good relationship book, and it's also good with sales. Basically, one of the tenets of that book is there's certain things you don't control. And if you don't control it, then don't get yourself all worked up about it. Parker, do you control the other side of the transaction?
I try to with all my might. No, I'm kidding. No, I don't.
The reality is we don't. It's just like you don't control your significant other, you don't control your kids, and if you do, it's a Band-Aid. You're not really making the change. So it's true as well, in contracts. So the reason why I bring that up is, can you imagine? And I'm going to pick on you, D. If instead of the tone I took with Parker, I came to you and said something that you think, D, listen, I've actually really been enjoying working with you, and I get it. We've got some significant issues in this transaction. They're A, B, and C. Here's what I would hate to see, D, and I think you and I can navigate this. You see what I'm doing here? I'm setting up the opportunity for success. and I'm not ignorant that we won't have to do some work on this, but I think you and I, because we work well together, can get through this. Because worst case scenario, oh my gosh, I don't know if you've ever gone the default route and having to deal with that hard feelings, and then if it's litigation, oh my gosh, what a nightmare, the cost to the clients. I'm painting the negative emotional picture, but I'm doing it in collaboration, right? But I'm also pointing out there, it's kind of like a soft shot across the bow to remind her clients that this is possible, but I'm not coming at her aggressively saying, we're going to do this, and kind of literally and figuratively pointing my finger, right? How do you feel when somebody's pointing their finger in your face like that? What do you want to do? Come on, what do you want to do?
Break it.
You want to smack the hand away, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
keep those images in your mind. But if in turn I was like putting my arm around, like, hey D, listen, we're working on this. You put a lot of time in. I'm highly appreciative of it. We've got to get a resolution to this, right? And what do you propose? I may think what she's going to propose is just stupid, but the fact that I'm allowing her to voice it means I'm encouraging collaboration. And if there's any chance that you're going to get past it, a problem, an issue, you better get to some place where you feel like you're collaborating. That doesn't mean you have to throw away your fiduciaries of looking out for your client. Is that clear? You guys understand what I'm saying? Okay. All right. But carrot's always better, but if you have to introduce some stick, do it still in a collaborative way and just be like, gosh, I would hate for us to get, both of our clients, because if we go this route in Section 16, both parties, they're going to feel bad about you and me, and we probably don't have referring clients. But you know what? If we can pull it off and work through this, we've probably got a client for life. So I'm just painting a way better picture, but I'm still dealing with the same issues. Is there any guarantee we're going to get them worked out? Not at all. There's no guarantees. But my experience in 20 plus years is the latter, if being collaborative, has the highest probability of getting a deal done. So I want to make sure you're clear on that. Sometimes when I talk with agents, you go to the terms of the contract, and I've watched this happen. I'm trying to educate them about what the contract says, but they in turn go right back to the client and be like, do you know what the contract says? And it's like, oh my gosh, that's not why we were having the discussion. It's just to understand the background context of what we're doing. We still have to be the pros. Make sense? All right. Section 18 is a very important section. Very, very, very important. And it's one that we get into trouble a lot of times. If there is going to be a change in the contract, if there's going to be a notice in the contract, right? What must be in place? Oh, it's got to be in writing. It's got to be signed by the party giving the notice. And what's the last part that a lot of people tend to forget? Must be received by whom? The buyer or the seller, or the respective agent, or the brokerage firm representing the buyer or seller. No later than, there's the key phrase, no later than the reference deadline in the REPC. So why do I bring this up? Why are we even wasting time on Section 18? It's a reminder, make sure you have all three components. But on item number C, please, I've had this happen so many times. It's kind of like, well, the agent said they never received it. They never received the notice. They never received the sign change. They never said, well, there's a whole list of people. You can send it to, if you have their client's email, you can send it to them. You can send it to the agent. You can send it to their broker. You can send it to their brokerage's firm, right? And you know what? If it's an important notice, like, oh, I don't know, cancellation of a contract, and there's $20,000 earnest money in play, you might want to send it to more than one person, like the agent and their broker, and CC your broker.
So contractually, Matt, all that simply says is that notice has to be provided. So if I were to just send it over an email, let's say the deadline is 5 and I send it at 4:59, and it's in their inbox at 4:59, but I don't communicate with them, am I still in the clear even though I didn't communicate with them? Obviously, the best practice is to communicate. I understand that.
There you go.
I'm just talking semantics here. Tell me a little bit, how does that play out if that were to be disputed?
So getting down to technical brass tacks, you're right. So let's say somebody, it's a Friday and there's a 5 o'clock deadline, and at 4:55 you're sending your notice, but it's Friday for them, and so they checked out at 3 o'clock, and they come back and say, well, Parker, I didn't open my email. That will never stand. That doesn't matter. But it's also why I recommend sending to your broker and sending it to their broker. That way everybody is on the same page. And it, you know what it does? I'm going to put this in just very basic terms. It gets rid of jackassery. Right? People trying to manipulate, give excuses as to why something didn't happen. When they know there's an audience, the stupidity of excuse making tends to be very minimal, if it exists at all. And so this is just one of those good practices. Make sure it's in writing, make sure it's signed by the party. So I get, the reason I bring that up is, well, I got a text. Is a text signed? No, it is not signed. And so there is a very specific requirement in the contract that both parties agreed to, and it's right here. It's like, no, it's got to be signed. So anybody dropping short of that is fundamentally contradicting the contract. And most people are like, why is that such a big deal? It's because somebody at that point is perhaps trying to either cancel the contract or give some other notice, and don't give them a reason to argue. Listen, I've got this from other brokers. There was a lawsuit back in New York, I think, I don't know, 5 years ago. And it's the only one I'm aware of in the country. And it was in a state court. So this isn't like a across the nation thing. And the court ruled that an email was notification. That doesn't mean that applies here in Utah, especially when you have a contract that has a specific requirement agreed to by both parties, which requires a signature. Okay? So if anybody gives you that excuse, go, yeah, A, that's New York. B, we have a contract that actually has a specific requirement. And when there is the existence of a specific requirement, you don't have the latitude to say, oh, well, an email kind of works. Okay? Make sense? All right. Here's another one. No assignment. So wholesalers are a real thing in our industry. Anybody had the pleasure of dealing with wholesalers? Come on, throw your hands up. Those of you that have your video on, the rest of you, no Christmas cards. Wholesalers are notorious for this. They write in the REPC, a lot of them. Now, there's some that are more sophisticated. There's others that say, and will use their own contract, but a lot of them still use a DRE REPC. And what do they put up in the top section for the buyer? Bob Jones, who's the wholesaler guy, and or assigns, right? And that's as far as they read. They don't actually ever read through the contract. What does it say in section 19? By default, I mean, it's in the heading, no assignment, right? It does make the case in the first half of the paragraph that Matt Barton, if I'm the buyer, I can assign it to Barton Building and Realty Company because I own that LLC. Or I can put it in the name of the Matt and Nancy Barton Trust because I'm the trustee for that trust. Those are permissible transfers, right? You got the term right here. Those are permissible transfers, okay? But here's the key line. I'm going to underline this in red. Furthermore, the inclusion of and or assigns or similar language on the line identifying the buyer on the first page of the REPC shall constitute the seller's written consent only to what? A permissible transfer. So that means to an LLC you own or a trustee. It doesn't mean I can assign my contract to Haley. I don't like the language on this, but if you just slow down and read it, if you have and or assigns, yep, you're basically still under the same restrictions of the contract that only allows a permissible transfer. So here's the question of the day. What if you do want to assign it to somebody else? What do?
You have to get their permission.
Okay, you do have to get the permission, but how does that show up in real life?
I mean, everything is negotiable if you put it into an addendum from the contract. So why can't you just simply copy and paste this and say, consent to any transfer?
You could do that, but you're now kind of acting like an attorney because this is attorney written language, and you as a licensee have the right to what? What does the division give us the right to do? Fill in blanks. So when you go in and start making changes to attorney's language, you could be accused of practicing law without a license. So I would not advise doing that. Now, here's something I was hoping somebody was going to say. James, are you going to give me the answer I'm looking for?
I just barely tapped in. Sorry.
That's okay. That's all right. The answer I was looking for is, oh, use the assignment addendum put out by the Utah Association of Realtors. It was a trick question. There's an addendum for that. And you're not being an attorney because the UAR attorneys wrote that. And that is how you do an assignment, because it takes into account all of the pertinent things. So for instance, if you just went with this, what's on the screen, and let's just say you said, no, assignments are permissible. All right, now the questions start flowing. Whose earnest money is it if it's assigned? Not a good answer, right? It's undefined. What happens to the due diligence that was provided to the first buyer? Is the second buyer held to that, or do they get their own disclosures? What about the deadlines? What about, there's a whole series of things that aren't well thought out when somebody just simply says, I'm going to assign the contract, right? And so this is why UAR created an assignment addendum. So they understand this, right? They help the state write the REPC, and they also wrote the assignment addendum, and they have the language that dovetails nicely with this and augments this and covers the key areas if you are going to do an assignment. Okay. So, but the easiest thing I want you to remember is the default nature of our REPC is there is no assignment allowed unless it's going to an entity that you already own. If it's being assigned in the wholesaler world to another buyer, fundamentally, originally, it's not allowed in the REPC. So get the addendum if you're going to do that. Okay. Insurance and risk of loss. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this other than, hey, if you're the seller, you're under contract, keep your insurance until you've transferred ownership. Time is of the essence. This is such an important one. We all know this, but I don't know that we're good at articulating this, right? This is the one that still, to this day, people miss. All the dates in here, unless specified otherwise, are 5 o'clock p.m. What time? Mountain time. Savannah, Heidi, any of my other office managers on the call, has this ever been an issue? Like you get a digital signature when they signed and it was Pacific and they missed the deadline? Does that ever happen?
All the time.
Yeah. So it's a real thing in the contract and you need to pay attention to this. And then the second one is when we talk days, right? And calendar days, it is always going to mean calendar days. You're not going to find in here anywhere where it says business days. And I still get that a lot from agents. Just remember the default in the contract is calendar days. Okay. All right. And you know, this is a good reminder to everybody that it's not saying you have to do things fast, but hey, look, section 24 is on there. Basically, this is a prelude to section 24. Time is of the essence. If I were to say it differently, it's like, hey, time and dates in the contract have real consequences, so pay attention. That would be my rewording of section 21.
Hey, Matt,
Okay?
have you ever seen any situations where people place in an addendum business days instead of calendar days?
I don't see that too often. I only see it when people are doing the counting and they get it wrong. They don't typically write it. They just, I know this is going to be shocking to people. They make assumptions. Oh, well, I assumed it was business days. Well, why would you assume that when the language, if you ever read your contract through once or got onto the contracts and negotiations call and saw and said, it's all calendar days by default, right?
Parker, this is Haley. I did that once about a month ago on a 1031 exchange.
Oh,
2
you
months ago.
did?
Because I needed the business days.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking
it's
in what
rare.
case scenarios. I had somebody a couple of weeks ago put an offer in on a property, and they were trying to extend their due diligence deadline. So they tried to put in their business days, and I thought that's very interesting. Of course, we didn't agree to it, but I was wondering what other circumstances it would be similar to. So that's it. Thanks,
Well,
Haley.
think about this though: is what about holidays, and what about pseudo
There you
holidays?
go.
And what about, for me, Fridays aren't a business day, so does that count?
Yeah.
Hey, James, here's another one for you. I know the rest of the country celebrates Pioneer Day, so we don't have to worry about that.
That's right.
Right? It's a state holiday, so this is
And
why.
if you're in New York, there's a bunch of Jewish holidays.
Yeah, right. And are we celebrating Columbus Day anymore? I mean, is it Indigenous People Day now? I don't know.
I think if you put that in, if you think about it that way, you could never again even consider business days as a valid criteria.
Yeah, if you get to that place, use a hard date. Just say by, February 15th at 5:00 p.m. Right? Don't introduce new variables that don't need to be there. Okay, on to section 22. Listen, this one's pretty important too. It's I get this a lot. If you've ever dealt with this situation where there's a siblings that have survived their parents and there's like 5 of them that have to sign on a contract, and it's like, oh my gosh, I got to set this up and it flows so that everybody is sequentially adding it. Or could you actually send out 5 versions of the contract and have them all sign independently? Well, section 22 answers that. The REPC may be executed in counterparts. That's a legal term for the signature doesn't have to be all on the same page. If the document remains the same and all the important people sign it, that is considered them signing the same document. Okay? Make sense? All right. Section 23, acceptance. People still munge this all the time, and it does have overtones back up to time is of the essence and the default 5:00 p.m. Oh my gosh, you guys, I've had so many times where people say, and this comes from brokers too. This isn't just agents. It's like, well, I called your agent and I told them that, it was accepted. We'd had conversations. We had all these different excuses. What is the requirement of acceptance? It actually has to be signed, which this is why our own office managers have encouraged people, when you're using SkySlope forms, don't do signature, do what? Or sorry, don't put date and time. Savannah, help me out here. Which is the one that has both?
So don't just use date because it only has date. Use
date, that's right.
Use the time option because it has date and time, and that's crucial for the contracts. So
yes, yep. Because we get this all the time as office managers. We're trying to figure out if a cancellation was done on time, if acceptance was done on time. And it's just like, well, crap, there's no timestamp. I know the date it was signed, but was it signed at 9 in the morning or 9 o'clock at night? And then that creates a cloud over the contract. So if you want to be better at your fiduciary of reasonable care, to be the pro, I mean, these are all things you could talk to your clients about to show that you actually understand things better than your competitors. It's just be like, listen, digital signatures are a real thing these days, but a lot of times people just put the signature on and they don't actually put a date and time stamp on there. We do that. And if we don't see that coming in, if we're representing a seller, we're going to fire back and ask them, we need something that actually has date and time on there so we know whether we have a valid contract. Okay. All right. Contract deadlines. There's a lot to cover here, but I'm just going to quickly talk about this. Do reasonable timeframes, right? Which are the two that have the term in them at the buyer's sole discretion?
Due diligence and
Due
financing.
diligence and financing. But dang, James, you beat me to it.
That's right. There is not that term for the appraisal deadline, right? It's not at your sole discretion. You actually have to provide documentation. Now, here's the question for anybody new on the call. What does that term sole discretion mean? If you were to translate that, if you were an attorney and you're trying to explain to a client what at your sole discretion means, what does it mean? You can't answer, Parker.
For any reason.
Like no questions asked kind of a thing.
Was that you, Savannah?
That was me and Dee.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, listen, here's the thing. A lot of times people think because their agent hasn't done a good job. Let's use due diligence for an example. And I've shared this before. I had this situation with a real estate attorney who's a friend of mine, and his wife was the agent on a transaction. And he said, well, we know that they're just using the financing deadline as an extra due diligence deadline, and wanted to call out our agent. And the situation was, it was a roof repair, right? And they had a due diligence addendum that said, yep, the seller's going to repair the roof. And it was like, I can't remember, it was like $15,000, $20,000 to get the roof repaired. And they did. And they did it. And then literally 5-6 minutes before the financing and appraisal deadline hit, the buyers instructed our agent to cancel based on financing, right? And here's the interesting thing. Due diligence just says anything that you find at your sole discretion, you can cancel on. It's even more interesting on the financing deadline. It says, if you're not satisfied, not qualified, satisfied with the terms of financing, at your sole discretion, you can cancel. I don't know how to tell. I got to create a mental image for you guys. That hole in the contract is so big, you can drive a semi truck through it.
Matt, I would just, I think to make it simple is, I don't even have to be able to articulate a reason.
There you go. Did everybody hear that? You don't even have to give a reason. You don't have to provide. I've had attorneys and other brokers say, well, we called your lender and they said your people were approved. And I just kind of chuckle. I don't try and be a jerk to them. I say, well, you know what? That may in fact be true. But have you ever read, section 8.3? Because that's not what it says. It doesn't say if they're qualified or approved. It says, are they, the buyers, satisfied? So let me paint a crazy scenario for you. What are rates today on a 30-year mortgage? 6.75, somewhere in that neighborhood? And you have a crazy lender at Lifetime who's willing to give your buyer 5%, and they're approved. Can they still back out? Of course they can, because they may have been hoping for 2% or 1% or a free loan, and they're not satisfied. Oh, they just jumped the hurdle of section 8.3. I'm not satisfied with the terms of financing, I'm canceling. So there's a takeaway for both buyers and sellers here. If you represent a buyer, that's probably your last drop dead deadline, but it's so big you can drive a semi truck through it. If you're representing a seller, you probably ought to be articulating this to them when they're looking at the deadlines for financing and appraisal. Because up until that deadline, there's not a damn thing you can do if they decide to back out.
Hey, Matt, in the circumstances that you just described with, the roof and everything like that, you said that they closed they backed out within 48 hours of closing. Is that right?
5 minutes. No, 5 minutes of the deadline.
5 minutes. So they backed out of that. I mean, they were past the financing deadline, I assume.
No. They were past the due diligence deadline.
Oh, okay.
They had not passed the financing deadline. And you know what? Paxton, the attorney, wanted to, this is just so unscrupulous. And you know what? It's not that I wasn't empathetic. I mean, I felt bad that his sellers paid $15,000, $20,000 for a roof repair and that the buyers walked out. But here's the point I tried to make to him politely, because I knew it was his wife representing the sellers. I said, unfortunately, your agent didn't do a good job of explaining the risks. If I was representing a seller, I would say, great, I will do the roof repairs, but I want an equal amount of earnest money that becomes non-refundable when the repairs are done. Then it has nothing to do with whether they cancel on financing. I got my expense covered. I was doing a better job looking out for my sellers. And there's 10 other ways you could structure that. That was just one example. So just be aware of those things. Okay.
Two things. One is you can always, as a part of that, have them remove the contingencies. But the other thing I was thinking is it's always, I think it's important to let sellers know that the only way we can maintain a market is by giving the buyer these opportunities. I mean, otherwise we have no market. If they don't have these opportunities to do their due diligence and to pull out, you've got two parties with unequal knowledge, and you have no, without these opportunities for buyers to back out, you have no market.
Yeah, you know, it's a great point you bring up, James. Right? We have to. Don't just dump the contract on your clients and hope they understand it, right? Your job is to be the Sherpa. You're helping them climb the mountain of a transaction, right? And giving them the appropriate expectations. Let's not go this way. Let's go this way. And oh, here's future pacing you of some things we're going to do. And so you're right, James, having that conversation with them. And here's part that I've said before, and I hope you guys remember this. Look at the bottom of this transaction, right? This is the December 4th, 2024 version that was approved by the Attorney General. If you were in the business all the way back in 2009, when this last changed massively, the contract at that point in time said the seller was responsible for warrantying the mechanical, the electrical, the plumbing, those went away in 2009. And this is the point I'm trying to make. Don't just tell your sellers that, oh my gosh, the buyer can leave the contract without any ramifications up until the financing deadline. Make sure you put it in context, right? So paint the good and the bad. Hey, the good news is, so listen, and this is why you want to know the history just a little bit. Back in 2009, sellers had to warranty the mechanical, the electrical, the plumbing, and the state basically finally got to a place where they said, this is just not a good approach. What we're going to do is in section 10.2 of the new REPC, we're going to tell the buyer, you're buying it in its as is condition without any expressed or implied warranties of any kind. So that's really in your favor, Mr. Seller. The trade-off was that the state wanted to make sure because of that the buyer had the opportunity to inspect it and get their financing in place. And up until those things were done, they have the terms sole discretion to walk from the contract. So it's a trade-off. You no longer have to warranty all those things, but they have the opportunity to inspect and walk away. So
Matt, let me just make one more point. There are still a lot of agents that operate pre-2009 and think that everything still has to be operational and warranted. So keep in mind that there are still a lot of agents that think that.
Yeah, it's true, James. And you know what? And most of the time, they're not bad actors. They just got in a rut of the way of doing things, and they haven't kept up with the times. And frankly, they just don't know what they don't know. And so it kind of goes back to what we started off with. There's a way to say it to them that is effective. There's a way to not say it. If you start off with, well, aren't you an idiot? That's probably not going to go well. As much as we may want to say that, probably not a good idea. But if we turn around and say, hey, you know what? I get that. And James, you're going to be my ignorant but good-hearted guy on the other side. I'll be like, hey, Jane, I appreciate what you're saying, and I don't ever want to talk down to somebody, but how do you read section 10.2 of the REPC? Because I think that's the important section here. Oh, what does it say? Buyer acknowledges. Who? It's not the seller, right? When a buyer puts forth a REPC, even though it's a state form, this becomes the buyer's language. It becomes their contract. They're adopting it. It's as if they're the ones coming up with these terms. They own it. So what does it say? Buyer acknowledges and agrees that in reference to the physical condition of the property, buyer's buying the property in its as-is condition, what? Without expressed or implied warranties of any kind. Now, if I had James read that, and he'd be like, well, when did they put that in there? Right? You'll get some version of that, right? But
well, and I think that's why we've talked about a lot, and you've talked about it frequently, is, you know, we get complacent, and we kind of revert to our the things we're comfortable with, and I every time I read it, I kind of have a little take on things based on my experience, but especially those of us who've been around a long time, you kind of forget how you know, what changes are made. So anyway, I think that's important.
Right. And go ahead, Dee.
I know I'm still really new to the business, but
come on, you're a veritable pro by now.
I always do mention section 10 as is, but I also think as listing agents, we should be careful on what we put in the remarks, because this last condo I had, they said that every corner of this condo had been meticulously remodeled and updated. My home inspector found that the AC in the furnace was 26 years old. So I got $10,000 and they gave me all that I wanted because that wasn't taken care of like they had projected that the house was.
Oh, Dee, it's a good thing you and I were not on opposite sides of this transaction, because this is great, because we're at the tail end, and I'm not going to have time to jump into seller's disclosures today, but this is fun. This is where I hope your knowledge as we go through this. And Ty, you're not aware of this, but if you want my marked up copy of the REPC, send me an email, and I'm happy to send you a copy so that you know the key areas. But if D, in your situation, right? Remember this: the MLS and the remarks are marketing; they're not contractual. And here's why.
I put it as an exhibit.
Okay, you did put it as an exhibit?
Yes.
Good job, because then it does become contractual. But let's assume for the minute that D wasn't the good agent that she is and did not incorporate the listing as part of the contract. Section 14 is super important, right? Here's why. The REPC, I'm going to read it verbatim. The REPC, together with its addenda and any attached exhibits, good job, D, and the seller's disclosures, constitutes the entire contract between the parties, and what? Here's the key language. Supersedes and replaces what? Sorry, I'm marking as we go. Supersedes and replaces any and all prior negotiations, representations, warranties, understandings, or contracts between the parties, whether verbal or otherwise. Well, in normal situation, wouldn't that cover what's on the MLS? Right? And now remember, this is the buyer's words when they adopt this. So they're the ones saying, hey, I recognize that this contract and what's in the REPC is going to supersede anything that's on the MLS, any other negotiations, any other warranties, understandings, contracts between the parties, verbal or otherwise. That is pretty all-encompassing, you guys, right? So if you want something covered because it says every square inch of the property has been remodeled, then do as Dee said, you go up to section 9, right? And you check other, and you say exhibit 1, copy of the MLS listing. And then you get a copy of the MLS listing and put a heading across it, exhibit 1. Now it's part of the contract. Anything that's said in there now is part of the contract.
So Matt, related to her point about updated, if I have a 50-year-old house with a 20-year-old kitchen, is it a new kitchen? Is it an updated kitchen? What is it? To me, I'm an old guy. It may be a new kitchen. To somebody young, it may be an old kitchen, but to me, it's at least updated. So those are terms that don't have a definition.
You're right. And so you bring up a good point, James. One, if you're going to put that in the MLS, then don't take a contract from D where she incorporates the listing, or if she does, counteroffer and say, sorry, not playing that game, right? Because at that point, it just is marketing in the remarks. and you're not held to it. I hope that is really clear for you guys. That's what section 14 says, right? But the flip side of that coin is if somebody does try and incorporate the listing, you better make sure everything in those remarks and everything else is okay for your sellers to be held to. If there's any questions whatsoever, don't accept that. Okay? All right, last thing on this is the offer and time for acceptance. I'm not really going to spend much time on that other than the terms for acceptance are very clear, right, in 23. I'm going to share one other thing with you here because we've had this in the past, and it's usually when we're in a little warmer market. So it's not anything you're probably going to deal with today, but when the market gets better and you're competing, situation a number of years back, there's a brokerage down in South Utah County. I guess I'll spare their names, but one of my agents put an offer in on a Friday night on a house, and the listing agent called and said, "Oh my gosh, thank you for the offer. That's great. My people have signed it and we're under contract." That's good news, right? Woohoo! Well, as they say, here comes the rest of the story. Saturday morning, apparently, another buyer wanted to see the house. They came through. The listing agent told them, "Well, we already have an offer at X. Let's just say it's 500. What did buyer number 2 do? We'll give you 510. And the unscrupulous agent on the other side, because they knew there was no paper trail and it was just a phone call, called, our agent and said, "Hey, we're under contract with a buyer. Sorry, you didn't get the offer." And then our agent was like, "What do you mean? You told me we were under contract. You told me that the client had signed our offer." And what did the other agent said? "Oh, you must have misunderstood me. I never said that." Is that a real life story? Is there anything you can do about that at that point?
This was all verbal. I'm assuming that none of this
It's
was
all
in writing.
verbal.
Oh no, you're
Now remember,
tough out of luck.
Now remember, acceptance says it must be signed by the people, that are accepting, and the seller, buyer, or their agent has communicated to the other party that the offer was signed. So technically, my agent was like going by the contract. The other agent told me it was signed. My point here is, don't rely on stuff that's unenforceable. What should my agent have done? I'm going to send you a text. Please respond back with, "Yes, you're under contract." I'm going to send you an email. Can you send me a sign? These are all options. Can you send me a signed copy of the contract tonight? But since the agent was just trusting and didn't realize that, somebody could do something as dastardly, their client lost out on a property. And there's nothing we can do. We could sit there and be like, and by the way, this agent was the broker, just for the record. But they're gonna have some nice story. I know that's what you thought I said, but actually I said they were considering signing it. I didn't say they signed it, right? There's gonna be 10 different, it's like dealing with kids. You're gonna get some cockamamie excuse. So my point is,
I'm holding everything back to not say the broker's name.
Yep, we'll not share the names to protect the guilty. But anyway, the point is simply this. There's a lot of things in the contract that you can hang your hat on that are solid. It's also important to know the things that aren't so solid. I've complained to UAR and their forms committee, why in section 18, if you're giving a notice after you're under contract, why is it required that it must be in writing, must be signed, just like acceptance, and received? Why are we not congruent? And you know what the answer was? It was a request from agents and brokers. It was too hard to get a signed copy. They just wanted to be able to go under contract easier. I'm like, well, you fixed one problem and created a more significant one. So I'm hoping someday in the future, we go back to the REPC that used to say, yep, it was signed, it was communicated, and it was delivered. Those things were all done, and we are now under contract. That would be fantastic. But it's not there today, so act accordingly. Make sure you get a paper trail that is actually done. Make sense?
Matt, curious to know, on the new iPhone feature, you can just tap a button and it's one-way recording automatically. And it announces that the phone call is being recorded. If these same circumstances had happened and I was recording the conversation because I knew this unscrupulous agent's way of doing business, would that cover me or not? Because it's still not in writing.
Well, you bring up a good question, and it is kind of a general answer I have for so many things when it comes to a contract. Do you want to even go down the path of having a fight? Right? The answer is no. So the best thing is to just get it in writing. Could I eventually go and say to that broker and be like, hey, I have you recorded, right? And it shows your phone number and the timestamp was Friday night at 6:00 p.m. and you said we were under contract. So technically, according to Section 25, we're under contract. So I'm sorry you put your property under contract twice. You better get rid of the other one because we're not going away. I'm now in a fight. It's much better to just have good business practices that say, hey, thanks for telling me we're under contract. I'm sitting by my computer right now. Can you send me a copy of the signed offer? And if they say no, great. Would you mind just sending me a text or an email saying we're under contract and that it is signed, even if you can't produce the physical document yet because they're out of town or something. I don't know. That's just your best practice. Okay, 2 minutes, 1.5 minutes to cover the last part. Remember this. When we have Section 9, right? Here we go. Where am I? Section 9. This is an important section because you don't get to play Chinese menu with an offer. If it says that the offer is the REPC and addendum number 1 and an FHA loan and, that is all the offer, one offer. You don't get to say, well, I'm accepting the REPC, but I don't like what's in addendum 2, so I'm going to reject that, but I'm going to accept 1 and 3. Go back to your pre-licensing courses. That's never acceptable. It's not contractually enforceable because I put forth an offer. It's almost like strip away the title addenda and just say more paragraphs in the REPC, right? Then it becomes clear what you have to do. You either are accepting the REPC or you're not. Accept, reject, or counteroffer. And when you do counteroffer, you're counteroffering everything. The REPC, addendum 1, addendum 2, addendum 3. And so on each one of those forms, the REPC, addendum 1, 2, and 3, you must check we are countering in addendum 4, and you put that on all of those forms. That makes sense? Last thing, if you miss the deadline for accepting the offer, not responding, there is no response deadline. There's only an acceptance deadline, right? Offer and time of acceptance. You miss it by 1 minute, and then you send back an addendum or a counteroffer that says, oh, we just wanted to change the settlement date by 1 day. And the seller signs it. Do you have to put in there that the acceptance deadline was extended?
No.
Who said no?
James.
James. Right again, James. Right again. Just remember this. First of all, when you go past an acceptance deadline, if it's just the REPC or the REPC and an addenda and you miss the deadlines, the nature of that contract is it is deemed canceled. I hear this all the time. I ask this all the time. Oh, it's voidable. No, it isn't. You did not accept by the deadline, therefore it is deemed rejected. Okay? So if you do a counteroffer at that point, go back to your pre-licensing courses, and we all know when you counteroffer, the counteroffer becomes its own entire new offer. But if you look at the top of the counteroffer addendum form, it says this with prior REPC and or addenda becomes the offer, right? So you don't need to put into your counteroffer and addendum time of acceptance extended till such and such. This one's dead. This one's dead. You're creating a new offer. You're incorporating terms from the old one, but your counteroffer addendum is literally a new offer with its own acceptance deadline. So you don't need to put that in there. Okay.
And same would apply then for a buyer who the seller goes, "Oh, we're not going to respond right now. Some of the terms we don't like," and I send over an addendum readjusting those terms, now all of a sudden the whole thing is back in play.
Correct. Because that addendum has its own acceptance deadline, right?
Right.
There you go. All right, we are out of time. You guys are great. I hope that was helpful. And now that I got all the markings on the last, 8 sections, if you want the updated version, send me an email. Any final questions? All right, you guys. This is we're February. It's time for things to get going. It's going to be not a flying off the shelf year. Get your head wrapped around that. Work harder, be a little more creative, because most of your peers aren't working hard and being creative because they're afraid of the not stellar market. So that typically translates, there's going to be enough business. So get after it. Okay. Appreciate y'all. See you next time.